CLI and a cross-platform IDE for C and C++. Download now.
Good morning. We're here to talk about this. Agility does not equal speed. Now, one of the interesting things is I've done versions of this talk. Sometimes I sometimes reuse the title but change the content. This is something I have learned. There's a version of this talk that's been around for a number of years, and I did this in the Netherlands, where you can generally statistically get better coffee than here. Okay, the thing is, the number of places that do coffee, the number of places that do good coffee, you want to find out what that rate is, because it's never 100%, it's never 0%. But it was one of those things that the organizers had asked me to do a talk. I think they might even, no, I don't think they asked specifically for this one. And I said, okay, you want something big? I said, yeah, okay, that's fine. And this is back in 2017, 2016, 2018, something like that. And they, and all around the building was plastered. Agility equals speed. We couldn't find the not equals. I said the message is exactly the opposite. It could not be further from what I had intended. So here's a notion. I want to use this as an opportunity to explore a number of things, ramble on a bit about history, but also try and find what is essential, because we are in a position here where this concept is now very much part of the software development language set. It's a quarter of a century old in that set from a terminology point of view. Practices and specific approaches, they date back further, but there is we have this problem. I think everybody's experienced this at one time or another, and with at least one concept. It's not whether or not certain things are intrinsically a good idea, it's what happens when they get popular. What happens to a good idea when it becomes popular? Oh, we're going to talk a bit about that, okay? It's my concerns over many things over many years. Is sometimes people say, yeah, but you could do this. Yeah, but what happens when everybody else does it? And it's always a sad story. So here we want to try and, but you can never fix the whole thing. You can never make it 100% work, but we can pull it back a little bit. So we're going to explore this. So yeah, that's the official ACCU kind of front. We were good with that? Good. Yes, well done. Right. Okay, now we can move to my slides. A number of years ago, we received a box. It was delivered. I genuinely cannot remember if it was for me or for I think it was for me. I cannot even remember what's in it, but I can remember this. I thought, this is just like deep, man. Because the cut is right there. We have Agile, and yet just around the corner is fragile development. They are that close. They are that close. I thought, wow, this is deep. The universe sometimes just delivers you messages through randomness. Either that, or as human beings, we love a coincidence and we can't help it. So this is what I want to talk about. You can find me in all kinds of places. I'm mostly given up trying to say my details because it turns out that Kevlin Henney is internet unique, so just find me. On some platforms, I'm Kevlin, and on others, I'm Kevlin Henney. And I don't really hang out on Twitter anymore. It's my ex. And I generally post. I'm generally more active on Mastodon and Blue Sky. I put Instagram there because I take photographs, but it's really weird to receive software discussions DM'd at me on Instagram. It's the wrong universe. It's about photography. It's not about software. It's not about my breakfast. It's not about my family. It's very, very simple in that sense. So let's go and try and find some definitions here. I'm a bit of a definitions guy, and I do love language because it reveals much about us. It reveals underlying intention. Sometimes it can reveal accidental history, and it can tell us something about what we're looking at. But here I actually want to look at the dictionary, because it actually offers a far simpler definition than pretty much anything you will find in any book with the title Agile in it. So going to the concise OED, so the Oxford English Dictionary itself is a large corpus-based dictionary, the actual OED is almost entirely useless as a usage dictionary because it's not intended as a usage dictionary. It's an etymological dictionary. It gives you the complete history of a word for the last 1,000 years. If that's your thing, that's the dictionary for you. If you actually want to find out how to use modern English, no. Concise OED, however, is such a dictionary. And here we have a number of things. For many years, I've pointed out that one of the simplest things, when we use the word agile, agile is an adjective. Now, why is that important? It's important because an adjective describes a property of something. It is an observation on something. So therefore, when we say that is agile, it's an observation. It's not a thing that it does. It's not a. It's a thing that it is. This cup is warm. This cup is white. These are warm and white. These are all descriptions and observations about a thing. We should, and therefore we can apply this observation to a number of things. And it doesn't matter whether or not a team is using an official agile approach or not. We can make an observation. It's like, yeah, they are agile, or they are more agile than they were 6 months ago, or that team appears more agile than that team. That's the point. It's an observation that we can make. It's not necessarily an absolute, and it's not a thing that you do. The question then becomes, right, how do we achieve this state? And what we will discover is that actually just going through the motions is normally not sufficient. There's normally something else going on there. So first of all, there is that. It does mean that you can't do agile. Yeah, it's so there's an important thing there. You can do Scrum, you can do Kanban. These are things you can do. And then what you're hoping for is to be this. And it's quite possible, in fact, we have an existence proof in most of the industry now, to do Scrum and not be agile. Okay, we've discovered that, oh, yeah, actually, there was a little bit more to it than we thought. Able to move quickly and easily. There are two things here. One is related to a rate or a speed. It's a time-based thing, or most obviously a time-based thing. And then there is this one, which feels a little harder to quantify, but it turns out to be hugely important. We want to be able to do this with ease. Ease is the kind of the lost dimension, because we can also apply this. It also tells us some of the conflicts that we experience when we say, yeah, we want to be able to move quickly and easily. Right, okay, is your code base agile? I can use it, I can use that term legitimately because it's an adjective. Is my architecture agile? Does it afford being able to move quickly and easily? And it turns out that your existing stuff has a remarkably large veto. You got a team of 10, actually you got a team of 11. And the 11th is the code base. And it has a very strong veto. And you've got 10 people. They've just gone on a Scrum certification course. They're all fired up. They're filled with passion and ideas and sticky notes. And it's just like, we are agile. And the code base is sitting there going, no, you're not. We're going to go this way. No, mate, I'm going that way. And that is really important. We've failed to appreciate that it is a systems thing. Okay, mindset is part of it. Practices that can enforce and encourage certain things, that's part of it, but it's not the whole picture. Okay, so there's something there. So what is it that most organizations do? Well, I've just presented you with two concepts. Wow, that is way more than most people can handle. So what we end up with, it's a noun, we're doing it. And it's all about quick movement. Oh, that ease thing, that seemed a little bit complex and tricky to quantify. Yeah, we're just going to go fast. That's the goal. And the problem here is that this has a massive side effect, a human side effect, which is busyness. So a lot of people who are doing Agile are just furiously busy. And there's a lot of busy work. A lot of it is not useful. They have driven up their failure demand. I'll talk about failure demand a bit later. And there's a certain sense of burnout in many cases. But what is also interesting is one of the hardest things about this, a lot of stuff in agility is actually about letting go. And this is particularly difficult for people who are detail-oriented. It's just like, actually, you've got to let some things just be. The future will figure that one out. Letting go of certain things is really important. But one of the most important things is to let go of existing practices and mindsets. That is incredibly hard to do. It's not just about adopting things, it's about changing the way that you approach things. And I had this experience a number of years ago, and it's actually kind of got me out of the agile consultancy, agile coaching game, this experience. It was about 10 years ago. In fact, I think it was 10 years ago. So this year marks the anniversary. And it's one of the few times I ever posted on Facebook about my work life. And it was pretty much, fuck it, I'm done. I mean, that's the TLDR. I used more words and sounded more professional about it. But it was a company, and I'd visited them, and I had not met a single developer. This was the first, and I was just like, oh no, it allowed me to understand I wanted to go back into the code. I wanted to spend time there. But I'd spent a lot of time talking to project managers and product managers, just 2 kind of workshop-based visits. And I was kind of like, no, this is just bullshit, I'm done. But one of the most interesting things that I had was the fact that they were trying to do stuff differently, and more power to them. They were really trying, but they had kind of screwed up a couple of years before. And that creates a really bad vibe in the whole organization. They had said, we did Agile 2 years ago. We were exhausted. The project manager spoke to me. She spoke to me and she said, it was just exhausting. And the problem is what they had done is, rather than kind of letting it go and stepping back and trying to get a big picture view, they'd basically taken all their existing practices, things that they might do weekly, they were now doing daily. Things they might do monthly, they were now doing weekly. In other words, they had not changed that. They'd done everything that they were already doing, but now at a faster rate. That is exhausting. We're asking you to do something really different. To do the project management practices that are traditional, that would traditionally occupy weeks and months, to compress those down into hours and days is absolutely knackering. But that is also not the intention here. So what they ended up doing was micromanaging. And that was exhausting for everybody concerned and not particularly productive. But that is also what a lot of organizations do, because the hard part is turning stuff off. That's the thing. We also have a number of mantras, because we live in an era where this becomes a thing. Okay, I've used the Facebook font and coloring, but actually Facebook did not create this saying. Anybody got a sense of its origin? We don't actually have a precise origin, we have an approximate origin. No, older. Oh, I saw a great tweet this morning. How did we fall for it? It's there in the name, Silicon Valley. How did we not see this? Oh my God, it was there all along. I'll leave you with that. Okay, it goes back to about the 1940s and 1950s. It goes back to an era, it comes from the States. It's an era of innovation, particularly in the military and so on. And this is the origin of kind of like the skunk works thinking. This is the kind of like, let's just try stuff. So it's a case of move fast and break things. And that is a description when you're in a safe context. It's not a general description for things like, I don't know, like democracy and stuff like that. That was not the side effect we were after. But we have a lot of this emphasis and this whole notion of speed. We have changed speed of delivery, expectations. I mean, I remember going to a talk around 2000, and it was prior to the term agile being adopted. The dominant, as it were, mind share approach at that point was extreme programming. That was the thing that people were talking about. And it was interesting because this was what we now call an agile transformation that a number of people had tried to run at British Telecom. And they had kind of 5 simple things that we're going to try and do. They weren't trying to mandate something. They just say, these were 5 observations they would make of teams. You'd basically say, doesn't mean, you're doing XP, but let's just move in this direction. And one of them was you must have working releasable software once every 90 days. Okay? That's 25 years ago. Tell you what, in British Telecom, I worked for British Telecom many, many years ago. The whole idea of, you mean we've got to have something ready and working within a 3-month scale, unheard of. I would rather sell my grandmother. In fact, here she is. It's like, it was just like scandalous and all the rest of it. And the point there is that gives you a calibration of the times. These days, organizations that wouldn't even brand themselves Agile are delivering at a much, much faster rate. Everything is now faster. We are always on and continuously. So there's a cultural thing there. So a few years ago, I started the slow code movement, if you like. Move slow and mend things. It turns out that we've got a little bit distracted by this kind of speed thing. And in fact, when people sort of say we want to deliver faster, and I don't spend my life going around correcting people, say, I don't think you need fast. Because because most of the time it doesn't matter except when it does. Every now and then it does. There is a distinct difference between these two. There is a huge difference. A lot of people are doing this, or trying to do this, and that's giving them busy work. These are not the same thing. My standard example for this is the fact that I have a staggeringly poor sense of direction. GPS, sat-nav, all of that was invented for me. Thank you very much. My wife has a really good sense of direction. And she can remember routes and things like that. I always take the simpler routes. Okay, I shall take the motorway because I understand the motorway. Oh, small streets. No, not sure about those. And what we discover is that, my wife and I, 2 different cars making the same trip, I will always drive faster, but she will always arrive sooner. That is the difference. In this particular case, you want to develop software more like my wife than me. Most organizations are doing it the way that I do it, with the way that I drive. The point here is that's the idea, and that requires you to move with more deliberation and awareness of what it is you are doing. This is one of the other things, awareness. Agility is actually very much, if we use something like people love to use sports analogies, so let's go for it. Agility here, if one thinks of a gymnast, there is a deep sense of awareness of their body and what they can do. That's what you want. And that's what I think is missing from many teams. They lack an awareness, a collective awareness, which includes team member number 11, the code, a deep sense of awareness of how we work and what we are good at and what we are not good at, what we know, what we don't know, what we need to know. Now, notice I've not listed any practices there. I'm talking fluffy stuff, awareness. And it's just like, well, yeah, actually, that's a really hard thing. And awareness is more, you get more awareness by doing this. And that gives you a lot of the benefits. So that's really what the message is. The problem is it's all got wrapped up. The whole speed thing's got wrapped up. And velocity is a term that a lot of teams use. Is anybody on a team or an organization where often people will talk? I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but we'll get to the downsides here, where they talk about development velocity or people try to measure velocity. Yeah, okay. Now, which process do we blame for this vocabulary? A lot of people think it's Scrum. A lot of people blame stuff on Scrum. Actually, Scrum needs a lot of ideas. Scrum is like the English language. It turns out that it became popular, but actually a lot of the ideas were kicking around before. I first heard velocity in the context of extreme programming, XP. And it's not a bad metaphor. But the thing about metaphors is be very careful how hard you push them, because they start pushing back. The idea of a metaphor is by definition incomplete and imperfect, because if it were perfect and complete, it wouldn't be a metaphor. That's a bit of a clue. Okay, it would be the thing. So metaphors are there, they're suggestive, but they are not there to be taken too literally. The problem is, so now you've got teams going around measuring velocity. Now, we do need to have an awareness of our own things, and that, it sounds like I'm going anti-measurement, all the rest of it. No, just a little bit more awareness. The problem is that there is something in this term. I think it would be fine if teams did actually care for their velocity. But we're in a technical domain. The word velocity, well, we need to be a little more aware of it. We're in a technical domain, so let's use the technical definition of the term. The term velocity has some very strong implications, and I really think it would be good if teams were aware of their velocity. The problem is, what we've got is that most teams are measuring speed, which is a magnitude. It turns out that velocity also includes direction. I think it will be a fine thing for teams to measure their velocity, but they don't. They measure some form of speed. They measure a rate, but they do not measure a direction. And what would this be in this case? Well, doing the right thing in the right way, for example. Just basically, are we building the right thing in the right way is a really simple question. Otherwise, we're simply answering a question. Kevlin, you're here soon. Yeah, I'm driving really fast. Okay, yeah. So, where are you? Can you tell us what's going on? I'm going to switch this one to Germany because then I can go a little bit faster. And so, I got myself a nice rental car. It's black and it's German and it's fast, and I'm going about 150, 160 kilometers per hour. That's fantastic, Kevlin. But which direction? Yeah, I know. I still have caution that is learnt. I love driving on the German autobahn because I'm sitting there going like, yeah. Boom! Something else goes by me. It's just like, Jesus, that must have been about 200. But I'm still driving like somebody who's been thresholded at around 70 miles per hour for most of their life. And I nudge it up to 80, but that gives me a default of around 130 kilometers per hour, maybe 140. But when I've got free rein, I take it all the way to 150, maybe 160. And there's somebody else is breaking the sound barrier because they grew up in Germany and they're cool with that. That's great. Yeah, that's great, Kevlin, but what direction are you heading? I'm heading north. You should be heading south. It turns out I would be better off walking. And that, again, is most teams. They are measuring and they are optimizing for the wrong thing. Are we actually delivering software, or are you going through tickets at a higher rate? Are you delivering software, or are you generating more lines of code? That's software is features. Yeah, and code clearly contributes to that, but you've got to kind of be a little more careful with that. And there are lots of teams that will focus exactly on the wrong thing and then measure it and reward themselves for that. But they're not being cynical. What they're doing is they're just responding to their environment. It's a systems effect. So let's just look at speed for a moment. And given that we're talking physics, it's does anybody know why it's always S in the Suvat equations? Spatial separation, yeah. So that's it. That's why it's S, separation or space. So it's the rate of as it were, spatial separation with time. So let's simplify that because we don't want to deal with derivatives here. There's enough derived stuff out there. So we're going to just focus on that, okay? Distance with respect to time. Now, the way that it's often measured classically in something like Scrum is there's something like a burn down chart. And it's just like, here's the amount of stuff we have to do, and then we burn it down with time. And so that's a valid representation. That tells you how much remaining work you have. But that's not really a complete picture. You need to have something that is opposed to that, which is actually, how much have we done? It's not just how much do we have left to do, how much have we done? In fact, you can combine all of these things and take it a step further and use things like cumulative flow diagrams, which I will leave outside the scope of this conversation. It's just to do with the visualization. How much have we done is also a really important question. Sometimes people call this a burn-up chart because it's the opposite of burn down. There are so many reasons to not use the term burn up. So many reasons. When my kids were small, oh, they're burning up. Yeah, they've got a fever. I'm really interested in space flight. Burning up, really bad thing. So burn up, people do it because it's the opposite of burn down, but you also have to understand, actually, Alan, you know this. Why is it called a burn down chart? Everybody says, oh, it's some kind of mystical, deep reason. It's really simple. Yeah, he flew Phantoms, and that's literally what the profile is called. If you are landing big fighter, not so big deck, you have to work out what your burn down, it looks like that. Otherwise, you hit the side or run over the end. That's literally what it looks like. Yeah, so he said, oh, that looks like that. Had he been a mountaineer, he'd have called that the south slope of something or other. So the point, oh yeah, K2 is now taller than Everest, I read. So, yeah, this week, it'll change again. Yeah, glaciers, things like that. So anyway, we're going to focus on accumulation, because the other thing that people are not very good at is being aware of, and this is a positive thing. I think people have heard of to-do lists. This is your to-do list, the ideal to-do list, cross things off. But have anybody come across a done list? Because sometimes you get to the end of the day, oh, Jesus, I've done nothing. Actually, that's not true. You've crossed off a few things, but you've added a lot of other stuff. See what you have actually done. And you feel better about yourself. Okay, so here's a question. We're going to move to software. What's S? Let's try stuff. Stop me if I'm being too technical. Let's try stuff. Okay, right, that's not unreasonable. The problem is we need a measurement of stuff. Now, sometimes people will use proxy measures. Story points is a classic one. Okay, in other words, it's an arbitrary unit that is supposed to be decoupled from time. okay, to avoid a bias. However, I'm not going to. So the standard line these days from a lot of people is story points are bad, and that's because they're not thinking. And I'm going to say this of actually, the thing is that story points have this classic thing that applies for a number of techniques, is that they work for a period of time or they can work for a period of time in a context. Because the idea is what you're trying to do is get out of your existing habits to reframe them. The problem is when they become settled, it becomes scorched earth. In other words, you have to know when to abandon. If your problem is we end up estimate. Did this in one organization, or saw this in one organization. They were estimating to the quarter hour. I have no idea of what my day looks like to the quarter hour, even in days where I have strict plans, like catch a flight. I could not tell you to the quarter hour what I'm doing, let alone something as fluffy and nebulous and complex as software development. Not a hope. You're kidding yourself. So the problem is if you're in that organization, then decoupling to something else, and there are a variety, choose them, find the one that works for you, but also be aware that you can use up that well. Story points work really well for us. 6 months later, we've been measured on story points and we've been compared to other teams and their story points, and now you've got a currency system. And it's become a currency, and it's subject to things like quantitative easing, tariffs. So for future, today is Liberation Day, where $1 trillion is being taken out of the world economy through just general bad management. So the point here is you've now got something that is nothing to do with software development. You created a currency system. At that point, you've gone past the point where story points were useful. Okay? In other words, you've used up that well. And just recognize sometimes a technique is a temporary thing. So organizations and individuals are really bad at having the idea of like, oh, this is transitional. I don't know what we're doing next, but this gets us from one place to another. And that idea of a temporary practice is absolutely vital. The agility is also in like, we're going to try this, see where that takes us. Oh, that didn't work. Great. Okay, what else are we going to try? It's not, we're going to try this and then we're going to commit to that for the next decade and this shall be how we're all measured. No, that is the very opposite of the term. The idea is it invites experimentation, but you have to recognize that something that worked last year is under no obligation to work this year. The universe does not work like that. So the idea here is story points are not intrinsically bad, but extrinsically they can become problematic. And once you've solved the basic problem of decoupling yourself from a culture of inappropriate commitments and false estimations, then you have addressed the problem and you're free to move to other approaches, of which, again, there are many. So the idea here is there's a problem here because this degenerates in a very particular way. So how does it degenerate? Well, I didn't really think about this and worry about this until I visited a company in 2008. And it was really interesting. I sat in with the Scrum Master for a moment, and he was nice. He liked using old school stuff, so he had a physical board and physical paper, and he would measure the story points and do this, and each day, and they'd stand around and kind of discuss it. And they actually had a really healthy culture of kind of like, okay, here's where I'm blocked, and I thought, oh, this is really functional. But there was one thing that I thought afterwards, and I said, I won't mention his name, but I realized what was going on. As he was carefully measuring with his ruler against this graph paper, you've got to always respect somebody who actually gets proper graph paper. I said, this is time. So's this. It's become a proxy for time. It's no longer an estimate of like how much work or how big do we think this is. It has become very accurately bound to time. There is a conversion rate between a story point and elapsed time. You are plotting time against time. You're not plotting distance against time. You're not even, in other words, you're not even at velocity. You are plotting something different. This is a dimensionless quantity, and utilization is one thing. Yeah? What is your utilization? Another one is, what are your actuals to estimates ratios? There are a bunch of others you can come up with, but the one thing you're not measuring is progress. You are not measuring progress of software development. So other measures of progress, source code. But And people often go, oh, lines of code is such a bad measure, or number of classes is such bad. Actually, again, I'm going to depart from the usual wisdom and say the reality is far more nuanced. Lines of code is the most precise measure of the lines of code that you have. If you're using any other measure, then it's crap and wrong. It is the most, in other words, it's how much stuff do we have. The number of classes that you have is the most precise measure of the number of classes. The number of files you have is the point here is that these are exactly what they appear to be. And so when you go to a team, and I had this organization I did some work for years ago, and I dealt with 2 different teams. And it took me a while to realize, but they had comparable functionality. They weren't building the same system. They weren't messaging systems. They were an organization. Any Bloombergers in here? Yeah. They were an organization not unlike Bloomberg, but not Bloomberg. And what it took me a while. It was my experience. It eventually allowed me to figure out after 3 weeks with one team, it's like, wait a minute, this system has the same amount of functionality, however we want to define that, as this other one, but they have completely different histories. And what was interesting is one was 100,000 lines of code and the other was 1 million lines of code. Okay? Now we're getting a sense of it. I'm telling you how big I want you to figure out which was the team that went home on time. Was it the 100,000 liners or the 1 million liners? Who had the tests? Who had the continuous builds? Oh, okay, it's the 100,000 liners. Who had actually the best development skills, or rather had nurtured the best development skills? Best development skills are not a magic thing that gets dropped from the skies. Who had the time to focus and do that? Which was the team that did the code reviews? It was the 100,000 liners. So 100,000 lines is not good or bad. 1 million lines is not good or bad. It's when you say, oh, that's a lot of stuff and that's even more stuff. That tells you the amount of stuff that people have to deal with on a daily basis. It tells you their environment. That's what it does. It does the rest of that. And then you take contextual measures of that. Oh, is that number going up, down, and how does that correlate with other things? So actually what you want is, but a lot of people then say, right, value. We want the value to go up. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it was actually not tricky before this. So value is a really interesting term, and we seem to try and optimize for it these days. This lovely Tom Toro cartoon from about 10 years ago. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And people use this term business value a lot. Now, I'm not going to say that I don't think it's important, but we have a problem. Business value, if your conversation hinges on business value, you probably don't know what you're talking about. And there are 2 reasons for this. One is this is not a defined term. It doesn't mean it can't be defined. It just means you have to define it. When you say business value, you have to answer simple questions. For whom? Of who receives value from this? You need to pick the person. An organization with customers, there's a lot of people there in very different roles. Because sometimes you end up with, I think my favorite story, or the simplest one I can demonstrate, was one many years ago. I was working on image processing related system, and the client wanted a way to be able to navigate previous images at particular locations, and to do so, and my boss thought 2 weeks of database work, we'll add that. Now, that changes the architecture. There were no databases involved in this. This was an image processing application with a windowed interface and all the rest of it. That's nice and simple. There's no databases involved. It runs locally. That's it. Suddenly you're introducing it. That's a really big change. And also, I'm not a database guy, so I didn't want to do 2 weeks of work on the database. But I kind of tried to find what's the heart of the problem here. The heart of the problem is, you mean, and this is what I said to the customer, we can create this so that we generate a folder structure and naming structure that is based on date and place. And therefore, we created an open product, so you don't have to use our product to look at your images. And you're free to do that, and you can do that independently of our product, and it doesn't have any database content whatsoever. And that will take me a morning to put in. So I saved nearly 2 weeks of work. Did anybody receive value in this relationship? Yes, the customer. As a team, I just lost us 2 weeks worth of work, and I had a slightly grumpy manager. He was always slightly grumpy, so that's never an issue. But the point there is I did generate value, but I also generated goodwill. So the point there is that we also end up with cases where people say, oh yeah, this generates this business value, but we've got a burnt out team. Well, I don't think the teams feel that there's great value in that. From their point of view, the business is scorching them. They're burnt out. So first of all, if you want to use the term business value, I'm not saying it doesn't, I'm saying on its own it doesn't mean anything until you tell me what it means. For whom? And what time frame? Business value is not some kind of constant of the universe. It's not a timeless thing. So just over 30 years ago, something quite interesting happened with phones, the GSM standard. What's one of the most interesting things about the GSM standard that was completely underestimated at the time? SMS. Those short messages, it was pretty much a footnote in the whole thing, 140 characters. Who would have predicted that there would be a massive market for text messages? I mean, there was a point in the late and the early 2000s where, you know, your plan, when you bought a phone plan, messages were a really big deal. I remember at one point, just like, yeah, and you get like, we'll give you 5,000 free messages per month. It's like, do I look like a teenager? I mean, thank you for the, you know, the accidental compliment, but no, I'm not going to use that because, you know, 5,000 messages per month. I mean, you just need to remember that there's only 168 hours in a week. There's only 1,440 minutes in a day, and I do want to sleep because I'm not a teenager. The SMS market was massive. What's the SMS market worth now? Absolutely fuck all. In other words, there is a time frame for value. You need to say, this gives us value for this customer or for our profit line or for this group. The point is, within a large organization, business value is not something that the whole organization receives. Or there are things you may do that may be a disadvantage to you, but may be a benefit to others around you. There are things that you do that will locally boost and be advantageous to you, but not necessarily the organization as a whole, or rather, not yet. In the 6 months, the story may be different to 12 months. If you're measuring something over quarters, then are you saying this is indefinite until the heat death of the universe, or are you saying there is a time frame for this? So, in other words, I'm inviting you to be, I know this is going to be hard, precise. Yeah? If you're using the term business value on its own, it's meaningless. You can give it meaning, or rather, you have to give it meaning. But then we also have another issue where we often try and prioritize things. But by default, developers have an instinct to prioritize things according to technical interest, things I want to do next, things that have been annoying me and I would like to fix, things that are cool. Yeah, or whatever it is, we have that. And so people often try and bring this with a sense of objectivity. Now, of course, so first of all, we have to define this. If we're going to prioritize by this, we have to say what it is. And then we have to prioritize by this. Now, there is a small problem with this thing, because the time frame we're dealing with means that we can't do this. I mean, I haven't told you what time frame it is. 1 week, you know, the coming week, the coming quarter, the beginning of next year to the middle of next year. I haven't told you what time frame, but every single time frame I just mentioned has one thing in common. It lies in the future. You cannot prioritize by business value. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't. I'm telling you you can't, because of physics as we currently understand it. If you know how to prioritize by business value, you will go to Sweden and collect your Nobel in physics, because you have discovered something that was previously unknown. The best you can do is prioritize by business value estimate, because you do not know the future. And if you do, what are you doing here? I mean, you know, there's so many more things that you could be. The point here is that, and it's, yeah, and sometimes people say, oh yeah, but Kevlin, it's not a really big difference. Really? Do you want to have a conversation about actuals versus estimates? Is that the conversation we're going to have? Okay, no, we're not. It's an estimate. Somebody's estimating, and estimates have a number of complexities associated with them. They reflect uncertainties. They are a distribution. They're not a single value. The point here is prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Now, what I love about this quote is not only does it sum up the problem, the attribution also reflects the problem. We don't know who said it. I want it to be Niels Bohr, the Danish quantum physicist, because then that's really cool. No, I probably, Dirac's a local boy, by the way. Dirac grew up about 10 minutes walk from my house. So, he's a Bristol boy. No, well, we know, one thing we do know is the person was most likely Danish. That somebody has traced it back, but various people get attributed with this. But what I love about that is that we don't know, and it was in the past. The thing that we should, in theory, have far more knowledge of. This is in the past and we don't know. So tell me again how you're going to predict the future. Okay, that's the point. And of course, you've got to be cautious, and particularly as is people who develop C++. I'm talking specifically to you. I'm not saying other people don't, but by God, C++ people, I'm just going to do this because I'm going to future-proof it. Oh, God. No, you're not. We've been doing this experiment for long enough to know that that was false, and there's a lot of accidental complexity created there. We'll come to accidental complexity later. When naming things like tables, always future-proof. If you sell wine, calling table wines will be confusing when expanding to beer. Beverages will be confusing when you sell ice. Products, confusing when you expand to services. Recommend tables be called stuff or table one. Yeah, we got back to stuff eventually, didn't we? Yeah. And there is a humor in that in one organization that we were doing code review, and it's just like, we were doing code review, and it's just like, the code was actually pretty decent. And it was like, and then I looked to the top, and on the title bar of the IDE, it's just like, Paul, you can't call this stuff. He said, but it is. I'm not denying that, but you've actually got some really nice class names in here, and, it does things that we can define. It does something a little more specific than stuff. We also see this with our various metaphors. People love roadmap metaphors. It's got to the point, I was talking about this for a number of years, and then, the pandemic literally gave me pause. I had no work. So I'm sitting there going, I'll do a talk. Let's look up, Google, PowerPoint roadmap templates. My goodness, there's a lot out there. And the roadmap there, you use it for architecture, you use it for products, and there's this whole idea of like, this is going to be the road. And a lot of them look like this. They look like roads, which is great. Now, there's a couple of things. Let's look at a real roadmap. Okay, first thing, there's only one road here. You don't need a map. I'm just going to say that straight out. You don't need a map. Even I don't need a map. Okay, I have a poor sense of direction. It's just like, it's up the road. Oh, which road? The road. My wife and I spent some time on an island of Scotland one summer, and she told me I could put the GPS away. She said, we go out of the house and there's one road. There's one onto the island and one off the island, and it goes round the island. Your choices are, do you go right or left? That is it. Okay, and right, that's mainland. Left, rest of the island. Okay, really simple. You don't need, that's an itinerary. You don't need a map. That's not a map. This is a map. Context. You are here. And the roadmap has possibilities. It has choices. That's the whole point. You're trying to show this is what is possible. These are the places we can go. And what you would do is you would say, so in other words, I think roadmap is a really powerful metaphor. It's just not, people don't apply it. I think it's a fascinating metaphor. I want to see those possibilities. When you say, okay, let's have a roadmap for our development, show me the roads. No, actually, maybe not show all of them. Show three. What I've come down to is, and recommended for people, is show me 3 routes. Here's the road we're currently on and we believe is the one we're going to stick to, or our preferred route, however we want to describe that. Here is an alternative path based on some of our initial understandings of the discussions coming from the products team. We might end up going off in this direction. Alternatively, we might take a technical point of view. These technical possibilities and blockers might take us down this road. So show me 3. 3 is normally enough to convince people, oh, you actually understand what you know what you're talking about. When somebody only shows you one road, They don't know what they're talking about, but they're trying to project confidence. Because if I give you one, then, hey, we know what the future is. If I give you three, then we don't know. But what you're actually doing is saying, no, I truly understand that we don't know everything, but that doesn't stop me from making progress or telling you what the possibilities are at this point. It shows you that awareness. That's the whole thing. It's just like, here is what we currently believe. Next month, we will have more information. We will have more data. We will have had 1 month more experience, and the world will have moved on 1 month. And we go, yeah, you know what? That one, the road we were on, that's no longer good. It's the whole point is that we are driving. We need to pay attention to what a modern map looks like. This route is 5 minutes faster. This route is 15 minutes slower. But it looked faster when you started. The times change. Pay attention to that. Use the modern metaphor. Embrace it. It's actually really good. But just as a humble reminder, when I Googled this is what I love. This one, it comes like, hey, here's your project. Here's your template. And obviously this was done in 2018. Here's your template. Mark it out. Add your project goals. 2020, did anybody have that in their calendar? In 2018, global pandemic fundamentally shuts down the way we work and changes the nature of our work and the work of our customers and everything. No, I didn't think so. You can't predict the future. Just get over it. That's fine. Embrace it. The whole point, for me, one of the most important things is when you look at agility done well, the whole point is it says you are working with incomplete knowledge. And that's okay. The illusion is when you think you have complete knowledge. Every day you get up and you get to the end of the day and you started the day with incomplete knowledge. You didn't know what was going to happen. And yet, well done you, good human. You get to the end of the day, you managed it. It turns out humans are remarkably good at working with incomplete knowledge. The problem is when we fool ourselves and say, oh, no, it's going to be complete. We need complete knowledge to make progress. No, it's software. The word soft is really important here, okay? So when we look at the design process, what we need to understand is that it is an iterative one. It's about revisiting and understanding. And this is like a really kind of modern-sounding quote from a 1968 document. Okay? I'm not saying we had everything figured out in 1968. I mean, we hadn't landed on the moon yet. That was next year. But we're actually doing pretty well. Other quotes from 1968 and things that were important. Conway's paper was published. If you've heard of Conway's law, it's that Conway. Anybody interested in coroutines? Yeah, Conway invented those in 1958, just in case you thought that, C++ was really being cool and up to date. Yeah. Most languages are playing catch up, but that's Friday's talk. But there's this one embedded in the paper. A lot of people kind of think this is a relatively recent quote. No. This is Melvin Conway. Mel Conway, yeah, he's quite inspiring. He's still alive. Met him a few years ago. There's never enough time to do something right, but there's always enough time to do it over. It turns out that this is the problem that we have. And we have it when we frame things in terms of business value as well. I've talked about how we want to define this more precisely. In other words, by default, off the shelf, this has no meaning. It's suggestive, which is fine. But if you want to use it as a driver and to encourage people to do things, you need to be more precise. But also asking those questions, whose point of view? Over what time frame? Those are incredibly valuable when you're doing product development. They're really important questions. The conversation you can have around this is wonderful and huge, but people don't have a conversation around it. They treat it as a given. It's not. But then we have this other problem that people then play this one off. They talk about feature work and they talk about technical work. And this is a false dichotomy. That's the XOR symbol. And they treat it as, our developers are doing either feature work or technical work. You must say, I'm prioritizing this in the backlog because this is technical work and it needs to be done. We need to migrate the build system. We need to repay some of the unmanaged technical debt. We need to all the rest of it. Oh, that's technical work. Features, that's how the business thrives. But there's a curious thing about the relationship. It's as if these two are somehow separate things. And you need to challenge that, even within yourself, because I hear people using this discussion, we've been told we need to prioritize feature work. And people are struggling with that, but they're not challenging it. Because I have news for you. This is software development. What do you think this stuff's made out of? What are features made out of in a software product? They are made out of software, not fairy dust, not project management plans, not good wishes and PowerPoint templates. Those are, when they are useful, they are there to assist and guide us, to illustrate the feature work that we may need. But the actual feature work is technical work. In other words, it's a subset relationship. It's not an XOR relationship at all. Feature work is technical work. That when it comes to that, you're building stuff. What it is made of stuff. That's the whole point. So, given that, when we look at this was the Agile Manifesto, drawn up 2001 by 17 middle-aged white guys. Immediately that kind of like, yeah, you know what, we can probably do better. Yeah, we probably can. But that doesn't invalidate this, because what is interesting here is that it's still ahead of what most people are doing. For all of its age, it's actually a really interesting piece of English. And most organizations that are doing Agile are not even close to this. So in other words, yeah, we could do better than this. But I'm not interested in could do, is are we even doing as well as this is the first question. Because this is not an approach, it is an evaluation of values and how we think about our approach and our philosophy. Important things, just from an English point of view, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. This is an interesting one. We are uncovering. That is the continuous English, that is a continuous present tense in English. Okay, English has 3 present tenses. Why have one when you can have 3 in the shower? Okay, it's just like, that's one of them. The continuous present implies an ongoing activity. We have been, we are, and we will continue to do so. And that's the point, we're never done. By developing software, by doing it, interesting enough, it turns out that the word agile comes from agere, Latin for to do. And helping others do it. It's a sense of community. It's the idea of this is a knowledge game, okay? And the idea is we're always moving forward and we're trying things out. That's the idea. It's experimental. It's about possibilities and awareness. Through this work, we have come to value, etc. That is, while there's value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Responding to change over following a plan. Now, this is really good because it's just like, it's very simple. It's got everything you need for a manifesto. It's not bad, actually. A manifesto should basically say, it's a line in the sand. We're on this side. Will you join us? Are you into this? That's what a manifesto should do. Artist manifestos, political manifestos, this is the history of them. And this is actually a good piece of writing. The problem is a lot of people just go, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but we're going to prioritize feature work over technical excellence. No, that is not the missing 5th value. That was not a thing. In fact, sometimes people say, oh, but the Agile Manifesto doesn't say anything about technical work and the quality of work and all the rest of it. Yeah, it does, but you have to read below the fold. There are 12 principles. Again, they've pretty much stood the test of time. And it's just like they're really clear about the relationship to the technical stuff. Continuous attention to technical excellence, that's where that phrase comes from. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. If you're not doing that, then you're just doing busy work. It's not some corollary to this. It's not some afterthought that somebody in 2010 said, oh, you know what? People are producing shit code at high rates, but we're making a mint on certification schemes. That's not the way that this one went. It was originally in there. It's a case of, because some of those 17 middle-aged white guys happened to care about technical skill and written books and had whole reputations built on that. They weren't going to suddenly say, you know, you're right. I just needed project management techniques. The whole thing is, it's the whole thing. It's a system. It's everyone, yeah? So this is the point. This is the point. That's one of the things of value. Jim Highsmith, one of the original 17, made this observation. This was an internal conference for an organization. Technical excellence is measured by both capacity to deliver customer value today and create an adaptable product for tomorrow. In other words, he wasn't looking at the next deadline. This is product development, not project development, and there is a philosophical difference between the two. Okay? Project management is about the next deadline. Product management is not about hitting the next deadline. It's about the deadline after that, the one after that, the one after that. And then there's a difference between a finite game and an infinite game. A finite game is bounded and has an end. Project management is distinctly, that's what project management is. It's distinctly unsuitable for most software development. And yet, we have project concept all the way through software development, all the way through. You open up most IDEs. What's the first thing they ask you? Do you want to create a new project? It's not a project. I talk to people and I say, oh, I've just joined a new project. Oh, how long's that been going? Oh, it's about 10 years. Wow, it took less time to get to the moon. Your project must be, oh, we deliver often. Well, wait a minute. A project, you're done then. What you're doing is product development. And it turns out many project practices are toxic to product development. This is not just a game of words. This is the whole point. There's a point here about the idea that the goal of the game is not to finish the game, it's to keep on playing the game. That's product development. That's a very different kind of thing. Again, it's about timeframes. So John said, so I mentioned value, I've mentioned failure demand a couple of times, so let's dig into that. Value demand represents the demands customers make for things they want. Things that are of value to them. This is John Seddon. He's a systems guy. He's not a software guy. He's done stuff for the NHS and all the rest of it. Has a number of strong opinions. I was fortunate to see him do a keynote a number of years ago at a Lean Kanban conference. And he's really interested in the whole thing. Let's look at the organization and what's actually going on. And he talks, again, we've got that term value, and we might want to define that precisely, but he is reasonably he has a reasonably strong definition. He's not choosing necessarily to quantify, he's leaving that bit open, but he's saying, here is the space that it's in. Value demand represents demands for the demands customers make for the things they want. And what we're talking about here is an economics point of view. Okay, so supply and demand and all this kind of stuff. And the way I normally think about it is like, there you are, you're in front of your keyboard, you got some code on your screen. What is the demand for your time at this point? Oh, I'm adding a new feature. Brilliant, that sounds like value demand. I am just literally adding that feature. And I said, oh, I'm adding, I've done that, I'm adding this to the build. That's value demand. The reason that my work is immediately connected to something that somebody wants. That's fantastic. And then there's the other one, okay? Of course, we can come up with many more classifications, but let's just divide the universe in two. This is not a permanent state of affairs. This is an exploratory. Failure demand is created by the organization not working properly. Okay, that's a very general thing. Let's be more specific. Failure demand is demand caused by a failure to do something or do something right. In other words, the reason for your work is you're dealing with a problem. The most obvious one, okay, what are you doing at this point? I'm there, I am fixing a bug. Now, that has a value consequence, but you're not adding value, you're restoring lost value. We promised you this much, you got this much. Yeah, that is a deficit. Yeah, it's that whole point is that you're not really adding value to the product, you're fixing a bug. You are working because there is something wrong. Now, it's not just confined to bugs, but bugs are the most obvious thing. I am fixing a bug. Here is the ticket, that's what I'm doing. You also find it when, what are you doing? Oh, I'm trying to understand this class. Oh, yeah, okay. So let's have a look at it. I see you're on line 9,423. Yeah, everybody's had their hand in this. Nobody's taking the blame. And, and it's just kind of grown, and there seems to be a lot of duplicate code, and I'm really struggling to understand it. Right. Now, this is the normal state of flow. What's happening is most of you, why are you looking at this? Because I need to add a feature. But actually, that time spent trying to understand it is not value demand. This is why it's hard to see, but once you start seeing it, it's just like, oh yeah. It's because it's woven in. The failure demand is woven in. I spent 8 hours today looking at this, and then 5 minutes at the end of the day adding the feature. Okay? 8 hours of failure demand, 5 minutes of value demand. In other words, unmanaged technical debt, the incomprehensibility, the systems that we fight. Oh yeah, I had to, and it's at the organizational level as well. Oh, to do this and check this in, that belongs to another team, so I had to go and get permission. And right, how long did that take? In other words, all of these things, and I want you to start thinking how much of your work is failure demand. Because I'm prepared to put money that, in an ideal universe, we'd say, oh yeah, it should all be 100% that. But we know no system can be 100% efficient. We expect there to inevitably be some failure demand. The fact that I think people do not realize is that this is the overwhelming majority. Proper 80 to 90% of demand is this. And that's quite important because it also tells us why organizations grow. A friend of mine went to work, I mentioned Silicon Valley earlier on. So Ray went to work at Silicon Valley a number of years ago, worked for a startup, and he came back to the UK. We went out for dinner. He said, oh, it's the last year we've grown so much. We've doubled the size of the software development group has grown by a factor of 2. We had 30 developers, now we have 60 developers. Now, at this point, I didn't have this vocabulary, but my simple question to Ray is, okay, that sounds really good, but are those 30 developers you've just hired, are they fixing the problems of the first 30, or are they actually adding this value? And that is the problem. When you start realizing, oh, maybe our organization is growing as a result of failure demand. But because we look at it as demand en masse, we haven't differentiated it. We're actually embracing the failure and making it worse. So ask that question of yourself and your team and so on. Understand what is the nature of this. If we are optimizing, if we're getting really good at doing this, and this is the thing, this is where we end up with skepticism. I had really interesting conversation with Greg Colvin, which if you've been around a while, Greg Colvin used to be on the C++ committee, worked for Oracle, really, really nice guy, some really good stuff, really good ideas came out of Greg. And was also early involvement in Boost. And I just remember him saying to me one day, he said, yeah, I visited a team and they say they're doing some agile thing. And I asked about how they were doing stuff, and he said, all I could see is that they were getting better at fixing bugs. What they were failing to do was not have the bugs. Yeah, I think this is attributed to Edwards Deming. There is this idea of the difference between quality control and quality assurance is an interesting one. Quality control is not giving your guest burnt toast. Quality assurance is learning how not to burn your toast. And that is a really important distinction, but a lot of organizations could do with wasting a lot less bread. Literally, useful metaphor, bread. Okay, so a lot of people, when we start talking about things like technical excellence and the things that slow us down when we're talking about speed, but also when we talk about velocity, the thing that might be heading in the wrong direction. Oh yeah, we are hitting, for the last 6 months, we have been hitting our feature goals, although it appears to be slowing down a bit, but technical debt is rising. It's going out of control. It's just like, okay, maybe you're not doing the right thing in the right way. You're doing the right thing in the wrong way. People often attribute, so technical debt, I have a whole talk on this, but I'm going to leave that to one side. I just want to focus on the fact that this is an effect. Most teams don't have a technical debt problem, or rather, it's not quite as they think. This is an effect. What is the cause? This is a symptom. What is the thing that gives rise to the system? Technical neglect. It took me years to see this, and I coined this term around 2022. And I've been started using it a lot since then. Because technical neglect is quite an interesting thing, because that is the cause. Because neglect is a thing that doesn't happen. It's not a thing that happens. Yeah. Sometimes you can see somebody going like, okay, I see you adding unmanaged technical debt to the code. Okay, I see you making a complete mess of this. I see you not following guidelines, techniques, or adding a dependency where we shouldn't have. Sometimes you can see that, but most of the time it's not that obvious. It is not a thing that is happening. It is a thing that is not happening. Oh, I see that you didn't do that. That's not an observation that we have. The problem is that our attention is often distracted. So the example that I use is this one. There's a boat, nice boat. We can take it out on the water. What we didn't know when we took it out on the water is it's filled with holes. And there are 3 ways that we can solve this, 0, 1, and 2. 2 of them are the way that software developers will solve them, and one of them is the way that the other 8 billion people on the planet will solve it. Let us look, first of all, at option 0, which I kind of regard as the null, the degenerate option. The boat is sinking. You're sitting there, oh, this again. It always happens, every project. Yeah, this is software development. Oh, there's nothing we can do. This is called learned helplessness. You just accept that the world is shit and every software development you ever get involved, yeah, that's always the way. There's a certain defeatism, but there's a natural kind of explanation for it. There are terms in psychology. Right, let's dispense with that one. Because clearly you are focused for action. You're going to do stuff. Agere, to do. Okay, we're going to do stuff. What is it we're going to do? We are going to empty that boat. It is filling up. We are going to get so good at emptying this boat. God damn it, we're good at this. Everybody else on the planet, maybe we should stop the water coming in. Now, it feels obvious when you say it like that, but I did have this experience a few years ago. I've run a few legacy code workshops, and how do we address our technical debt? And we've done stuff, and I've come up with helped teams come up with plans out of these workshops and all the rest of it. And sometimes they actually do something with them, and other times they go, "That was nice," and that's the more common one. But then sometimes people do, and I thought I was really surprised when a team actually did follow the approach, and it worked. And then they had the same problems again in 2 years' time, because there was a thing that was unspoken and was obvious in my head, but nothing is obvious until you put it out there, that you should stop adding to you. Whatever it is that you were doing that caused the technical debt, you should stop doing. In other words, how do we not have this problem again? It's not simply how do we solve this problem, it's how do we avoid having that problem again? It's a separate question. It is not the same question, and it requires a different focus and a different awareness. And there is something inevitable about all of this. As an evolving program is continually changed, its complexity, reflecting deteriorating structure, increases unless work is done to maintain or reduce it. This observation was made by Meyer Lehman. Meyer Lehman made this observation in 1980. Just for purposes of calibration, 45 years ago. In 1980, let me just take you back, and this was based on his work in the 70s. Let's go right back to 1980. The word legacy was not used. The word legacy did not appear in software developers' lexicon until 1989. The debt metaphor had yet to be created in 1992. People already knew that there was something going on here, but he systematically explored it. And what I like here is he's not saying it's because you're doing a bad job. Sometimes people sort of talk about technical debt and all this kind of stuff as you're doing a bad job. It's like, actually, no. He's saying it's an inevitable consequence. Deteriorating structure is what happens when you do anything unless you also do something else. If you're doing a really bad job, then yes, you will deteriorate faster. But even if you're doing the best work, it means you probably overlooked something because you've got focus. There's something else you need to do. And that's really important. Whenever you change anything in a structure, your laser sharp focus, like that function, I'm going to put my best practices on that function. The problem is you've overlooked the fact that perhaps that function is duplicated somewhere else. So now you've got an issue of two different versions. And this itself is brilliant, but there were other consequences. Or that there is now some dead code that you didn't notice. Or whatever, I don't know. That's the point, is you are so focused on this. Focus by definition means you're focused on something, by definition your attention is taken away from other things. And that's fine. But it basically says whenever you have any kind of structure and you do anything, even if it's the best thing, you've changed the structure. You've changed a thing that was in happy equilibrium. And you must address time for that. It's part of the work. I normally use I normally use a kitchen metaphor, but when I talk about this, but what was great is that in 2021, Yvonne Lamb solved my problem for me. My theory of tech debt is that housework is the correct metaphor for the thing we call tech debt, but we can't use it because tech has been made up of people who don't do housework or manage housework being done. If I had a physical microphone, I'd drop it at this point. She absolutely nailed it. And that's the point. If the very act of living in your house causes it to be messy. And that's not necessarily because you are a messy person. Yes, it's worse if you are messier. But even if you're tidy, you have to put extra work into the very act of existing in that house. You do something in the kitchen, guess what? And you were clean. You did not use every saucepan. I refer you to my younger son at this point, who has a expansive approach to cooking. It's full-bodied and it's, comprehensive and messy. Son number one is more like a ninja. Has he been here? I see a fork has moved. Oh. But the point here is the very act of doing that. The very act of putting socks on in the morning. God, so Pete's optimized this one. The very act of putting socks on in the morning. I mean, I don't normally wear socks at home. That solves that problem. But, you know, the very act of putting socks on in the morning means that you're going to have to do something at some point sooner rather than later, not next week. So the point there is that you've got to do something. The very act of living in a code base and doing the best job still requires you to do additional work. That is part of the deal. That's not because you did a bad job. That's the point. And he also uses the word maintain, and that's a point. He uses the word in a way that I would consider metaphorically appropriate. Maintenance. You are maintaining the integrity and design and vision and qualities of the system. Whereas we use the term maintenance these days for it's being done somewhere. We've got continued development and it's being done not here. Yeah? Or we're fixing bugs. That's not maintenance. If you're maintaining this bug, I love it so much, I'm going to make sure this bug stays and is perfectly maintained. No, that's not the meaning of the word. Metaphors are tough, I get it. But the idea here is that maintenance is an action. The problem we're dealing with is inaction. That's the thing. We go to the OED. Neglect, that term again. Want of attention to what ought to be done. The fact of leaving something undone or unattended to. Negligence. This is a simple idea. And this has a huge consequence for the shape of our work. So we can actually see this also reflected by other vocabulary in the Mythical Man Month. Now, what I find fascinating, Mythical Man Month is, so Fred Brooks died recently. Most common thing that is quoted from this book is Brooks' Law. Adding more people to a late project makes it later, but there's a wealth of other stuff here. Now, what is interesting is you can tell this book is old because of the title. We wouldn't tend to use the term Man Month now. It was published in the 1970s, the first edition. It was about a project in the 1960s. Then he wrote a series of essays in the 1980s that were then collected into the second edition, published in the 1990s. All of this is still last century. So what relevance does it have to us here in the 2020s? Quite a lot, because it turns out that he was talking about human beings. And there's a lot of stuff in software that has changed, but we haven't really evolved. We are still very much the same humans that we were back then. And it turns out that for all the changes that we experience within software, there are some surprising constants. And he asked this question in the mid-80s. So 40 years ago, he's asking this question. I would refer us back to this. How much of what software engineers now do is still devoted to the accidental, the non-essential stuff, as opposed to the essential? That's a really good question. And it's very much, we would frame it, value demand versus failure demand. How much of the stuff, accidental complexity, is the stuff that is not directly to do with your domain problem? Yeah, and that's our technology choices, it's our managed technical debt and all the rest of it. That tells you where the time is going. That is the stuff where your code base is vetoing your actions, which brings us back to this. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff here, and we can write all kinds of linguistic interpretations, but I quite like this piece from Dan Schnau from a couple of years back. That's it. Focus on relationships with people and actually solving problems. Don't make user stories and have retrospective meetings just because it says to do so in some book or by some coach. We're not saying that these are intrinsically bad things, but, don't do it because the book said so or you're copying something, and that's the biggest problem that we have with a lot of these things. We have people aping or copying things. It's what I would call the football shirt syndrome. It's just like, yeah, it's my favorite team. If I wear their shirt, then I will play like them. And that's kind of like what you see is a lot of teams doing this. I am going to follow this practice without understanding how it fits together with everything else. And that is really important. So I just cited, I've just talked about mess and my offspring. I'm going to go back to son number 1 and son number 2. When they were little, when son number 2 was at the food redistribution stage of eating, okay? And number 1, who's nearly 4 years older, is at the helpful child stage. Okay, little kids love to help, and they copy what they see. And it was only because I was standing over by the kitchen sink that I got this privileged perspective. My wife is going around, she's cleaning the crumbs and the mess off the table. She's moving her right hand like that. So number 1 copies her. What he doesn't see, because he is short, is that what my wife has is her left hand is cupped beneath the table. So she is wiping the crumbs and things into this hand. This is what makes that work. So what number one is doing is taking the locus of distribution and increasing it. And that is the way that most organizations adopt agile practices. They see this. They do things like, oh, the Spotify model, and you see this. I did a whole load of consultancy visits for Spotify pre-pandemic, and they've got a really nice, back then they had a really nice culture. And what you discover is that for all the stuff that people talk about in the Spotify model, that's certainly something, but what makes it work is the bit you don't see. And honestly, half of it is just Swedish culture or Scandinavian culture. It's just that, but it's just like, oh, this is a really nice place. That's most of it. That really is. Honestly, that's how you do most of this stuff. It's oh, we have a toxic work environment and what we're going to do is do it faster. It's not the way that you do this stuff. It's this stuff here. And so whenever you're getting a real iceberg effect with a lot of this stuff, okay? So that's the bit that, so the Scrum stuff, whatever. In fact, that's the whole point, is that it's not that they are wrong or invalid in their advice. It's just they are missing the bit that makes it work, or the bits that make it work, because they are far more subtle and nuanced, and they are much more interconnected. Do what works for whatever your situation. Just make sure your values and priorities are in order. Now, I would also remind you that first sentence there on the screen is not a license to do what you currently do. I've seen a lot of people do this. Oh yeah, this works for us. Does it? You've got comfortable with it, but people tolerate a surprising amount of pain and normalize that. The point there is that this is an invitation to experiment. It's, okay, we're doing this, let's try something else. That didn't work. Okay, let's try something else. Oh, that seems to work. Right, find out what works for you. So I would modify this. I would modify this to make it more obviously a process of inquiry. Find out what works for you. Be genuinely inquisitive. Do not assume that you've somehow optimized yourself into your current situation. You probably stumbled into it, and there are probably good things that you're doing, but there's probably some things that are not so good. See how they fit together. See what their origin story was. Yeah? We often pick up habits and techniques and issues without really interrogating them and understanding where they came from. That's the whole manifesto. So there's a kind of a point here about a number of these ideas. And we have this idea of, organizational structure and the various bits and pieces. Collectively, what you're trying to do is, I'll refer back to this book from 2002, 2003, The Wisdom of Crowds. There are elements of this book that have dated, but James Surowiecki's book that had some important observations. One of which is you're really trying to harness group intelligence in this context. But he's saying just getting a bunch of people together is not enough. The 4 conditions that characterize wise crowds, because you can have, normally when we talk about groups of people getting together, you can have groupthink, which is the very opposite. The 4 conditions that characterize wise crowds: diversity of opinion. In other words, you don't all hold the same views. Independence, you have independence. Well, importantly, you have independence from one another. You don't influence one another unduly. Now, this is very hard because we are very social animals. Decentralization, we have different ways of drawing on different information. We come from different backgrounds, because otherwise you have a monoculture. And this is a problem. Recruitment normally means that the way that we recruit is we normally recruit in our own image. It's a very natural kind of tendency, but you have to be aware of it. There was a company in London a number of years ago, a fintech company, and I did some series of workshops for them. Once every 6 weeks, I'd rock up to London and we'd spend a number of hours just focusing on, so I'd give people homework and we'd kind of review that, and then we'd kind of focus on some issues. And what was interesting, this is a fintech company, they're all games programmers in this team. Which means that they're all late 20s to early 30s and male. And they were all self-taught, C++, nothing wrong with being self-taught, as long as you understand that that might not be every habit you pick up that you've contrived yourself may not be the best way to do stuff. Just putting that one out there. Socialize your knowledge. And what was interesting is that that's because the head of that group was a games programmer, and it comes from the games industry. And therefore, I want people I can trust and I know who are going to be good developers. I mean, for those of you who works in fintech, just before I slag you off. Yeah, you do. You kind of do. Yeah. I did my time briefly, and it was just like, oh, wow, there's some really bad developers here. Okay, that was deeply judgmental and not very humanistic of me. Okay, I'm allowed at least one. There we go. So the point there is that this guy was after, okay, who do I know? Who are the kinds of people? Yeah, my people. Come over here. Let's do some fintech together. So that was very much that. But they all suffered the same blind spots. They were not clones of one another, but nonetheless, the intellectual diversity and range of thinking was surprisingly narrow. And that's the point. You want people to be different because you're solving a harder problem. Quote of mine from a talk a few years back: biggest advantage of autonomously working autonomously working teams is risk reduction through increased group intelligence. That's what you're trying to do. There's more here than one brain can do. We need to bring that out. How do we act bigger and smarter than the thing that we're building? Yeah, we need to organize ourselves so that we have that available. So this wonderful study, there's little correlation between a group's collective intelligence and the IQs of its individual members. Okay, these are variously known as referendums and elections. But if a group includes more women, its collective intelligence rises. What I normally say at this point, and seems very applicable here, is you could be smarter. It changes the nature of the conversation. It just draws in a very natural difference, and we see this right across the board. This was not what they went for. William Malone were looking for some other effect. I since had this paper referred to me by a psychologist friend who said, "Oh, have you come across this?" And it's funny, I've quoted one of the popular secondary sources on it, but my friend is very big on let's just check the validity of this stuff and it comes to this via a different route. So yeah, this is sound stuff. What we see is that very act of you want to be big, big smarts do not come from having clones. You need to be bigger and smarter in that sense. You need to have people from different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different educational backgrounds. Okay, you need to have people who don't look like you, that come from somewhere else, all this kind of stuff, because you've got to think bigger than the thing that you're working on. You're not smaller. And that's a problem. That doesn't mean that you want toxic people. There's a very important distinction here. But there is this idea of there's got to be this kind of like bigger idea. There was one idea in James Surowiecki that I didn't mention, which is aggregation. You've got to bring it all together. When we look at our architecture, the architecture is an aggregation. It's where we bring it together. The aggregation is the conversations that we might casually have, whether it is by the coffee machine, on Slack, just the casual bits and pieces. That's the connective tissue. But so is the source code, the config files, the tests. These are all connective tissue. The aggregating entity that we're collectively working on, that's there. That's the idea of this stuff. So there is there's an important number of things here that we need to consider when we look at this stuff. And referring back to this, stuff we need to be careful of. This is all about individuals and interactions. And there's a very important point here about processes and tools. We value these over this. But what has happened in the last 10 to 15 years is that every time I talk to somebody about agile development, what they tell me about is processes and tools. They never tell me about the people and their actual interactions and how they actually are and whether they're happy and stuff like that. People have got obsessed with things that have logos. I'm not saying these are intrinsically bad, although, yeah, some are worse than others. Scrum is actually not intrinsically a bad thing. Anybody here doing or has done Scrum? It's a surprisingly simple thing. The problem is, when you actually look at it, it's just like, well, that's a bit simple. You can't make anything out of that because it's mostly figure out what's going on. It's a framework. It's intentionally incomplete. It's kind of like, okay, we've offered you a lightweight thing to start with. Here's your starter pack, but it's not complete. Go and do something with it and build something out of it. It's deeply worrying when an organization says, we are doing Scrum by the book. Oh, that's very frightening. The point here is it's an experimental framework. It's intended to invite experimentation. You adapt it. The idea is that if you are in a Scrum organization, your teams are doing variants of Scrum, and that's okay because they've been working on what works best for them and their interrelationships. The idea is if you're doing the same thing you were doing 6 months ago, that is not Scrum. If you're doing it by a book, that's definitely not. So we have the problem Ron Jeffries highlighted. Scrum, for our purposes, is the thought and action cloud around the word Scrum, around the Scrum notion. Scrum is what the whole Scrum system is and does, not necessarily what this simple model is. And as Ron observes, Scrum, seen as the whole system, is very much anti-maker and anti-making, despite the goodwill of everyone I know inside that system. What he's talking about here is the fact that it does not encourage creative thought and technical excellence. That's the collective, nobody ever said you're not going to do this. It's just the way that it has become and the way people talk about it. So I don't have a particular, I have an issue with the way Scrum is practiced, but not intrinsically with the idea of Scrum, because it's so lightweight and simple that there's not a lot to complain about. There are other perspectives, though. There are things I do have a grievance against. There's this wonderful quote. This body, which was called and which still calls itself the Holy Roman Empire, was in no way holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. This is a quote from Voltaire, just about a decade before the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire's observation on the Holy Roman Empire seemingly offers a template for describing SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework. It doesn't scale, it's not agile, and it's not a framework. Apart from that, you go for it, knock yourself out with the certification. I do have an issue with this one. And so here's the problem we have. A lot of this stuff is related to scaling. I have a separate discussion about scaling, but I want to wrap up with another observation. When we talk about this, that brings us back to where we started so that we can understand this. There's another thing here, responding to change over following a plan. This is a really simple idea. The idea is a plan is a snapshot of our current understanding. That's fine. It's not a commitment. But I want to focus on this phrase, because responding to change, let's relate it back to velocity. Responding to change, changing something, changing your velocity, we call acceleration. Okay? It's a second order derivative. It's about how you change the speed or the velocity. And acceleration, because, hey, guess what? Physics also includes deceleration. It's just acceleration with the opposite sign. The idea here is that agility is actually not about the speed. It is the ability to change that speed. It is not about just the direction. It is the ability to change that direction. For years, you might sometimes see people using lean and agile in the same sentence. For years, sometimes people regard them as very, very different. Sometimes it's the same. Sometimes it's a subsetting relationship. And it's actually only relatively recently I realized that if you actually look at what a lot of the lean stuff is focused on, it is focused on very much dealing with this, optimizing that. Agility actually has a slightly different message, and both of them overlap. But agility is about your ability to change that direction and that quantity. It's not about the speed. What you want to be doing is measuring the team's acceleration and deceleration. How are they able to respond? When there is a situation or a change, whether it's a change in team composition, whether it's a change in the organization, change in the requirements, change in technology, or an actual crisis, what does that response look like? That's a different quality. But a lot of the stuff goes back to what I was kind of highlighting at the beginning. I'll end with a quote from Austin Kleon, an artist who, conveniently enough, is actually based in Austin, Texas. There's a beautiful bit of nominative determinism there. So I should be called Bristol Henney. And does that mean you have to change your name every time you move? I mean, is he confined to Austin forever? I don't know. These are questions to which I do not have answers. Nonetheless, I love his books. They are very much about creative work, and much of what he says can be felt to be inspiring and relevant in the creative work of software. And he has this observation and recommendation for us. It's impossible to pay proper attention to your life if you are hurtling along at lightning speed. When your job is to see things other people don't, you have to slow down enough that you can actually look. That is the point. If you're in software development, it is your job to see the things that other people can't see. It is your job to engage in those details, to highlight things, to suddenly go, wait a minute, do we actually need to do this at all if we change this? Or if we put in all this work, wasn't there a thing about, I had this with one team where this is like, but maybe that we don't need to concentrate on this piece of the system that causes us pain, because there is a government regulation that is changing and means this software will no longer exist in 6 months. At that point, you can step back and say, that's great. We can live with that for 6 months. I don't need to worry about it, because in 6 months' time, it's no longer necessary. It's nice when you actually have a schedule that is external, that genuinely is a true deadline. It's just like, yeah, we don't need to worry about that. So there's no point in investing time. The idea is just slow down, look and see. And so many times when you fix small problems, but I'd also say larger systemic issues, it's just like, take a step back, look at the bigger picture, and suddenly a lot of that busy work just evaporates with a simple question or a simple alternative idea that somebody came up with. And for me, this is where it is. This is where the agility lies. And there are measurements that may contribute to that, but be very careful that you don't fall into that trap of thinking, oh, it's speed, because a lot of people do, and that causes us a remarkable amount of pain and creates a lot of shit code, which just seems a really good way to end the talk. So thank you very much. So